The creature's roar shook the walls of the throne's citadel hard enough to crack the ceremonial stone floor. 3 of the Queen's elite HFY warriors, soldiers who had walked through plasma fire and survived orbital drops without armor, turned and ran. Not retreated. Ran. Weapons abandoned, rank forgotten, survival instinct overriding 10 years of conditioning in a single heartbeat. Sergeant Dara Vasquez didn't move. She stood at her post beside the inner chamber door, hands clasped behind her back, eyes forward, watching the chaos with the same expression she used when reviewing morning reports. Around her, the grand hall of the Velshera throne citadel was dissolving into controlled panic. Advisors pressed against walls. Court officials whispered prayers to their ancestors. Even the Queen's personal herald, a being with 4 heads, each one supposedly incapable of fear, had gone utterly silent. The war beast, HFY, had broken its restraint harness. Vasquez had read the briefing on HFY when she'd been assigned to the Joint Diplomatic Security Detail 6 weeks ago. The document used words like apex biological weapon and irreversible territorial instinct and 0 successful domestication events across 11 species. The Velshera had bred HFY's kind over 4 centuries, selecting for aggression, size, and pain tolerance, until they produced something that made their enemy surrender just from seeing it approach. A single adult stood nearly 4 meters at the shoulder. Its hide deflected standard pulse fire. Its claws could open a tank. And its psychological effect on any sentient species that shared evolutionary fear responses with large predators, which was nearly everyone, was functionally weaponized. 10,000 warriors across 3 galactic wars had stood before a HFY in the field. Records showed 112 had held their ground. The other 9,888 had broken. HFY was now walking toward the center of the throne hall, and the sound of it, low, resonant, rhythmic, wasn't a roar anymore. It was something worse. A hunting patience. An intelligence deciding. Queen Valnareth sat perfectly still on her obsidian throne, and that stillness was the most frightening thing Vasquez had seen all morning. The Queen wasn't afraid. She was calculating. And her calculation was costing seconds that nobody had. The diplomatic summit between Earth's Consolidated Authority and the Velshera Sovereign Collective had taken 19 months to arrange. Vasquez's job, along with 12 other human security personnel and roughly 200 Velshera royal guards, was to ensure nothing disrupted it. The secondary objective, which her commander had spoken quietly and only once, was to not embarrass humanity in front of the oldest spacefaring civilization in the known cluster. So far, they were failing the primary objective spectacularly. HFY stopped at the center of the hall. The massive head swung slowly, scenting the air. The eyes, 4 of them, set in a wide arc across a skull built like a geological feature, found the cluster of cowering dignitaries and held there with a predatory patience that made the silence feel physical. One of the Velshera royal guards raised a suppression lance. HFY's head turned toward him with terrifying speed. The guard lowered the lance. Smart guard. Vasquez did the math without meaning to. HFY massed somewhere around 4,000 kilograms. The hall was 40 meters across. The distance between the beast and the cluster of dignitaries, including both Earth's Secretary of the Interior and the Velshera Prime Accord, was maybe 15 meters. Even if every weapon in the room fired simultaneously, the volley would need approximately 2 seconds to accumulate enough energy transfer to stop something that large. HFY could cross 15 meters in less than 1. She became aware of the sound of small feet on polished stone. Vasquez didn't look away from HFY. She didn't need to. She had memorized every person currently in this hall as part of standard protective procedure, and the light step pattern moving behind her belonged to one specific individual. Myra, the 8-year-old daughter of Earth's secretary, who had been sitting quietly with a tablet in the antechamber and was absolutely, categorically not supposed to be in the main hall. The child stopped just to Vasquez's left. Vasquez felt rather than heard the small intake of breath. The recognition. And then, because children did not yet understand the difference between things that were safe to be curious about and things that were not, Myra took a step forward. HFY's 4 eyes shifted. Found the child. Everything in the hall stopped breathing. The war beast that had driven 10,000 warriors to break and run lowered its enormous head and fixed its full, undivided attention on one small human girl standing in a formal dress with a tablet tucked under her arm. Vasquez moved. Not fast. Controlled. She stepped between Myra and the beast with the same deliberate calm she used for every physical action, deliberate, clean, no wasted motion, and placed one hand gently on Myra's shoulder. "Stay behind me," she said quietly. She did not draw her weapon. The Queen spoke from her throne, one word, in Velshera command register, and every guard in the hall froze. Not from obedience. From shock. She had ordered them to stand down. Vasquez understood Velshera well enough to follow basic court protocol. She did not understand why the most powerful ruler in the cluster had just ordered her own security force to stand still while her prized war beast stared down a human child. HFY took one step forward. The floor cracked under the weight. Vasquez held her position. Her hand stayed on Myra's shoulder, steady, present, a pressure that said I am here and I am not leaving. She kept her breathing measured. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was. She had a read on her own biology precise enough to know her heart rate had spiked and her peripheral vision had narrowed slightly, classic acute stress response, nothing she hadn't managed before. HFY took another step. Myra, behind her, made a small sound. Not a scream. Something quieter. The sound a child makes when they realize something is real in a way they weren't prepared for. Vasquez pressed her hand just slightly firmer against the child's shoulder. Stay. Not a command. A promise. The beast stopped 2 meters away. At this distance, Vasquez could feel the heat radiating off it. Could see the individual scales along the ridge of the skull, each one the size of a palm, overlapping like ancient armor that had grown rather than been built. The eyes were extraordinary up close. Not empty, the way she'd expected. Complex. Layered with something she didn't have a word for yet. The hunting patience was still there, but there was something else moving beneath it. An evaluation running at a frequency she couldn't quite read. HFY's head lowered another half-meter. Vasquez did not step back. This was the part, she knew, where every documented interaction with a HFY in close proximity had gone one of 2 ways. The subject had either fled or been still enough long enough that the beast's territorial calculation resolved in favor of ignoring them. The problem was that none of the documented subjects had been standing between a HFY and something the beast appeared specifically focused on. She heard Myra breathe in sharply behind her. And then, Myra said, very quietly, "She's scared." Vasquez processed that without moving. "The spots around her eyes," Myra continued, voice barely above a whisper. "They're pulsing fast. Like a heartbeat. That's what my tablet said about the HFY species file. They do that when they're stressed." Vasquez let her eyes track, just slightly, to the ring of chromatophores around the nearest of HFY's eyes. The child was right. The spots were cycling rapidly through a dark-to-light pattern. She had read the same species file. She had not remembered that detail because it had been buried in a technical appendix that covered, among other things, biosigns of a HFY in a pre-attack state. But Myra had flagged it differently. Not as threat data. As empathy data. The child moved. Vasquez's hand tightened reflexively. But Myra wasn't running. She was sliding forward, pressing gently past Vasquez's hip, not pushing her aside but threading through the gap at her side with the particular physical confidence of a child who trusted completely that the adult behind her was still there. Vasquez let her move. The decision happened faster than thought. It felt correct in the way things felt correct when they had already been evaluated at a level below language. Myra raised her hand. Slowly. Palm up. Fingers open. The same way, Vasquez noted, that you'd approach an unfamiliar animal. Not reaching. Offering. HFY's massive head dropped until one eye was level with the child's outstretched hand. The chromatophores were still cycling. The heat off the beast was enormous. Vasquez could see every muscle along the creature's neck and shoulder, coiled, present, capable of an explosive release of force that would end this in a fraction of a second. Myra did not pull her hand back. The hall was so quiet that Vasquez could hear the faint hum of the Citadel's environmental systems. Could hear the Queen breathing somewhere behind her. Could hear her own heartbeat, still elevated, still controlled.
Katara's nostrils fluttered.
The great head moved forward those final centimeters, and touched Myra's palm. The sound that came from the war beast was not a roar. It was not a hunting note. It was a low, resonant vibration that Vasquez felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears, a frequency that took her brain a full 2 seconds to categorize. It was purring. HFY was purring. The chromatophores around the great eye slowed. The rapid cycling settled into something long and measured, a deep blue that held without flickering. The enormous body, 4,000 kilograms of the most dangerous biological weapon in the known cluster, shifted its weight, and the posture changed in a way Vasquez read as clearly as a flag going down. Not submission. Release. Myra scratched gently behind the ridge of the skull, in the gap between two scale plates, in the exact location the species file listed as a social bonding site used between HFY and their offspring. The war beast closed 2 of its 4 eyes. Vasquez became aware that the queen had descended from her throne. Not swept down in ceremony. Walked. Quietly, in the way of someone who needed to see something up close to believe it was real. She stopped at Vasquez's shoulder, a proximity that broke 12 layers of protocol, and looked at the child and the creature with an expression that Vasquez's training in Velshera facial reading translated, imperfectly but clearly enough, as I have ruled for 40 years and I have never seen this. The queen spoke again. Still quiet. The word she used had no direct human translation, but the closest equivalent in Vasquez's working vocabulary was bonded. The summit resumed 4 hours later. It resumed in a different chamber, a smaller one, with lower ceilings and warmer light, and HFY was present for it. The beast settled in the far corner with Myra leaning against her flank, the child having fallen asleep somewhere in the second hour of formal negotiations, one hand still resting on the warm scale plates of the creature's shoulder. Nobody removed her. Nobody suggested it. Secretary Harlan Voss, Myra's father, a man who had navigated trade agreements across 6 stellar systems and understood political theater as a second language, caught Vasquez's eye at one point and held it for a moment. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't have the words for it yet. She gave him the small nod that meant later, I'll explain later, and returned her attention to the room. Queen Valnareth had reorganized the summit agenda. The changes were structural, not cosmetic. Several hardline positions that the Velshera delegation had arrived with that morning had been quietly reframed. The terms that emerged by the end of the first session were better than anything Earth's preparatory team had modeled as achievable. Vasquez documented everything in the security log with her usual economy. Behavioral anomaly. Threat neutralized. Protocol adapted.
Outcome favorable.
What she didn't write, because it didn't belong in a security log, because there was no field for it, was what she had understood standing in that hall with her hand on a child's shoulder, 2 meters from a creature that had made 10,000 trained warriors break. HFY had not been threatening them. She had been alone in a vast unfamiliar space, surrounded by beings who feared her, and she had been terrified. 4 centuries of breeding for aggression had produced a creature with no vocabulary for its own fear, and so that fear had come out the only way it knew, as something that made everything around it smaller and farther away. Until one child had read the correct line of a species file and understood that the monster was scared. Vasquez filed her report at 0200 Citadel Standard Time, sat alone in the security anteroom for 11 minutes, and then stood, straightened her uniform, and returned to post. 6 days later, on the final morning of the summit, the Queen requested a private meeting.
No ads. No interpreters.
Just Vasquez, standing in the small garden adjoining the royal quarters, while Valnareth walked in slow circles among the cultivated things. I want to understand something, the Queen said, in the careful but precise standard she had apparently always known and chosen never to use before. You stood between my war beast and that child, without a weapon drawn. Yes. Why? Vasquez considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything. Because drawing a weapon would have been a decision, she said finally. And I hadn't made that decision yet. The Queen stopped walking. You were waiting to see if it was necessary. Yes. Most beings never wait that long. Most beings decide what something is before they look at it, Vasquez said. The child looked first. Valnareth turned toward her, and, for a long moment the most powerful ruler in the cluster regarded the human sergeant with the same complex, layered expression Vasquez had first seen in HFY's eye. An evaluation running at a frequency that was difficult to read but not, she thought, impossible. I have bred HFY for 400 years, the Queen said, and I have always understood them as weapons. Your child understood her as something that was suffering. She paused. What do I do with that? Vasquez held the Queen's gaze. You already know, she said quietly. Valnareth looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then she nodded, once, small, precise, and turned back to her garden. The accord was signed that afternoon. The terms included, in a subsection that Earth's legal team would spend 2 months parsing, a joint research initiative on Kethra cognition and welfare, framed in diplomatic language, buried under clauses about data sharing and academic access. Vasquez noticed it. Didn't say anything. On the shuttle back to the orbital station, Myra sat beside her with a tablet on her knees, reading something with the focused calm of a child who had already moved on to the next interesting thing. Vasquez sat with her hands in her lap and watched the citadel shrink in the viewport until it was a point of light and, then, nothing at all. Sergeant Vasquez. Myra said, without looking up. Yes. Do you think she'll be okay?
Ketara.
Vasquez thought about the Queen in her garden, about the subsection in the accord, about the way the chromatophores had slowed and gone blue. Yes, she said. Myra nodded, satisfied, and turned a page. The shuttle accelerated into the dark, and, behind them, in the throne citadel of the Velshera Sovereign Collective, the most feared war beast in 3 galactic wars lay in a newly designated quarters, larger, quieter, with controlled temperature and a skylight panel that cycled through spectra calibrated to her biology, and the spots around her eyes held steady and deep blue, and did not flicker.